Sinister greetings to everyone listening. I hope you've all enjoyed your holidays. This year has been one hell of a ride, and I would like to take a second of your time to thank each and every one of you for supporting my channel. I can't wait to see what kind of horrors next year will bring, and I hope you'll be joining me for the most sinister of content. In today's video, I have picked out 5 of my favorite stories from this year. So, grab your holy water, crucifixes, and anything else you think will protect you, as we get into the sinister readings.
It started with blood on the bathroom floor. I had just showered and shaved. This was a big deal for me. I lived alone, and after a year without a job, I had let myself go. What was the point? I had always thought, I've nowhere to go, no one to see. Most days would be spent on the sofa, watching garbage TV. This was the morning when all that would change. I don't know what had flipped my switch, but I woke up feeling focused and determined. Starting today, I would begin to look for work. I would exercise, and in the evenings I would read. Maybe even sell the TV. Stupid thing. Every day would begin with me shaving and showering. The daily shaving was probably a bit excessive, as it takes 2 weeks for me to grow the wispiest of beards. But that wasn't the point. Pride, self-discipline, they would be my watchwords from now on. Seeing the blood deflated me. There were 3 thick puddles of it. I was such a klutz that I had cut myself really badly while shaving, with a safety razor. I wiped condensation from the mirror and looked for the fresh gash. Only my skin was unmarked. Well, this was weird. I must have bled from somewhere else. I took off the towel that I had wrapped myself in after the shower, and with a lot of twisting in the mirror, I checked myself all over. Nothing. I wasn't the prettiest sight in the world, never had been, but there were no cuts in sight. I took a deep breath. This made no sense. But I knew that things could go one of 2 ways. I could let it get me down, a path which led me back to the sofa and daytime TV. Or I could get on with things. I had a plan, a life to sort out. I decided to clean up the blood, then go for a 2-mile walk. A drawback was that I did not have a mop, so I would go to the mart and buy one. I would also use it to clean the kitchen floor, the first steps of deep cleaning my apartment. Liking my new life choices very much, I headed out to the shop. I was soaked wet by the time I got back. Stiflingly hot weather, punctuated by downpours, seemed to have become the norm for summers now. I was hesitant as I went inside. After every rainstorm recently, the apartment is filled with a rank smell. It leaves me feeling nauseous. I have complained to my landlord and the local council, but they both ignored me. The stink seems to come from the plug holes in my bathroom and kitchen, so I have always figured it's the drains. Surely that was the council's responsibility. I decided to phone them then and there, and get on at them until it was sorted. New me. Go get them. First, I went to towel myself dry. The smell in the bathroom was off-putting, but I braced myself. Once that was done, I figured I should clean my teeth. The incident with the blood earlier had made me forget to. Dental hygiene was important from now on as well. I brushed vigorously, then turned to see if the old and unopened bottle of mouthwash in the bathroom cabinet was still usable. I took a swig and was about to spit it out, when I saw the sink was full of broken teeth. I felt sick, began to fill at my mouth. But my teeth were all still there. Shakily, I grinned at myself in the mirror. Like the rest of me, they were not in great condition, but none of my teeth looked to have fallen out. So what the hell was in the sink? They looked like teeth, were riddled, as I studied them, with decay. Using kitchen roll to cover my fingers, I did not want to feel the things touching my skin. I dug them out of the sink and put them in the kitchen bin. Feeling shaky, I went to sit on the sofa. The smell filling the apartment was worse than ever, and my head was now pounding. I decided to watch a little TV, just to calm my nerves. Something familiar. I don't know how long I was out for, but it must have been a good, deep sleep, because I woke feeling a lot better. I could see it had gone dark outside, and reluctantly decided to leave my busy list of positive to-dos until tomorrow. Today had been a setback, but I had to use such things to make myself more determined. I was still on track, until, rousing myself to get up, I saw the dark stains on the carpet. I must have stood in something, walked it in with me. They were close to black, but with a crimson hue, like congealed blood. The filthy stains trailed from the bathroom. I needed to clean them up. My bladder, suddenly busting, took precedence. I needed to go badly enough that I only hesitated for a moment outside the bathroom door. The stench had intensified while I had been napping. It was so bad, my eyes began to sting. It needs must, though. I stepped into the bathroom. The stains went up to the base of the sink. There was something odd about them, though. They were smaller than my feet and pointed at one end, more like a claw than the front of my battered old trainers. Which made no sense. I paid my call of nature, then went to wash my hands. My hand hovered over the tap. A dark liquid was bubbling out of the plug hole. It was little more than a dribble at first, but its flow was becoming heavier by the second, and there, buried in its twisting, rising form, was a single, rotten tooth. Then another, and another. The liquid shimmered, and I was looking into a gaping, inhuman maw. I staggered backwards, slamming the door shut. I dragged the sofa over to block the door, to keep whatever was in there from getting out. Then I hurried out of the flat. I can't remember going down the stairs. I was standing on the street, breathing hard, fear burning in my guts. I was fine, though. I was outside, away from it. Sweat trickled into my eyes. I wiped my hand across my face, saw that my fingers were stained with the darkness that had come from the sink, that had been traipsed across the carpet. Had it touched me while I slept? I felt paralyzed with terror, but forced myself to put one foot in front of the other. I wanted to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and it as I could. I reached the end of my street, waited for the break in traffic before stepping off the pavement into the road. I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a storm drain next to my foot. Inside it, inches below me, I could see the darkness. It was blood red. I began to cry, the sobs racking my body. It was flowing all around me, beneath the city streets. I ran for a long time, until I reached the bay which fringes the city. The pipes would bring it out there, dispersing it into the ocean. I wanted to somehow see, to know that it was being washed away. And then, maybe, I could begin to feel safe. Then, I thought, what if it is not flowing out to the sea, but was born, an aberration of nature, out there, and is slowly, steadily, moving inland, drawn by our sound and warmth, wanting to reach out and envelop us. I am standing looking out to sea, lost, hardly daring to breathe. There is no escape.
Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. What a time of year, ain't it? I still remember my first Halloween. My first real Halloween, mind you. Not the manufactured bullshit they shovel down our throats year after year. Now I'm talking about All Hallows Eve. I'm talking about Samhain. I'm talking about the one night of the year when monsters walk the earth. I was 11 years young when I first experienced the horror of Halloween. I'd been out with a friend, roaming the streets with bags full of wrappers and stomachs full of candy. We'd been out looking for some fun, some excitement. You see, once you reach a certain age, Plain old trick-or-treating doesn't really do it anymore. No, you need something special, something terrifying. I think that's why we took a stroll down Blackbriar Lane. I think that's why we went looking for the decrepit one, in all his wicked glory. I think that's why I watched somebody die. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Yes, I suppose that I am. So, let's rewind, backtrack. Allow me to set the scene. It's October 31st, and the night air is crisp. The leaves are red and gold, and the neighborhood is all lit up in jack-o'-lanterns and full moons. There's mischief in the air, and there's murder. Earlier that week, a kid dies. They find his body floating down the river like he's out for a swim, except he's fully dressed and missing his head. You ever tried to identify a body without a head? Without teeth? Well, apparently it's easy. See, little Greggy Hall had a nice mum, the sort that most of us can only dream of having, and the lovely lady went ahead and stitched his name right into the side of his jacket. Just like that, we knew who was dead. Open and shut, case closed. But what was he doing dead, without his head, floating down the river, when he should have been in bed? Was it a prank gone wrong? Maybe the poor kid slipped walking across the trestle. Or maybe, just maybe, someone sick and twisted was out for blood, and innocent little Greggy was too good a target to pass up. Who could say? Truth is, nobody had a clue. Not the sheriff, not his mother. Not a single soul in town could have told you how little Greggy came to find himself so waterlogged and pale. But here's the thing about secrets. None of them last forever. This one didn't even last the week. It was me and Andy who figured it out, late on Halloween night. We took the turn down Blackbriar Lane, because that was the way you made it into Shelton Wood, and that was the place they'd found Greggy Hall's decapitated corpse. Before I go any further, I want you to know that I don't mean Greggy any disrespect. He was a good kid, a kind kid. That night, though, in the heart of October, he had become so much more than that. He'd become a legend, a ghost story come to life. That night, Greggy Hall became the reason I don't celebrate Halloween. That night, I crossed Blackbriar Bridge with Andy Delton, and together, the two of us walked into Shelton Wood. The trees there are like nowhere else. They're thick, almost so thick that they press in on each other like blades of grass, smothering for space. Once you step beneath the Shelton canopy, it really doesn't matter if the moon is crescent or full as the sun. You're not going to see a damn thing. It's dark in there, desperately so. We used our flashlights to navigate, doing our best not to tear our costumes on the branches as we passed. And my mother had spent all month saving for my Dracula outfit, and Andy had saved up half a year's allowance for his Spider-Man get-up. We weren't about to walk out of there full of rips and holes. No way. But we had work to do. See, Andy and I knew something about Shelton that not the sheriff or Greggy's mother or even the pastor knew. We knew that Greggy Hall had been talking about hearing voices in the woods on the way home from school. We knew he'd said he saw something watching him from the trees. We knew all this because his sister, Sally, was in our grade, and she told us about how religious their mother was, how fanatical. She told us our mother once convinced the pastor to drag Sally into those woods and perform an exorcism on her. She told us she thought her mother's paranoia was starting to wear off on poor little Greggy. So, when Greggy started talking about hearing voices, seeing things, we thought it was just nonsense. Make-believe. After all, he wasn't describing seeing a man, woman, or animal in the trees. He was describing something. A monster. He was describing seeing a nightmare come to life, and even out here, in this little slice of nowhere on the edge of the map, we knew that monsters weren't real. No, we thought we did. But then pop goes little Greggy's head, and the next thing you know, we're fast believers. So fast, in fact, that we brought the news straight to the police. And guess what happened then? They chucked our statements into a drawer and told us they'd look into it. First, the damn pastor wants to ban access to Shelton Wood, and now kids are saying it's haunted. We heard them laughing all the way up until the door closed behind us. Town full of nutjobs. No. It was up to us. We thought about inviting Greggy's sister along, but we knew she wanted time alone. Time to mourn her brother. That was fine by us. The whole thing, this little investigation of ours, was just a scouting mission anyway. We weren't expecting to encounter the creature that stalked Greggy Hall from the trees. We weren't expecting to fight for our lives. But then, these things so rarely go according to plan. We spent an hour roaming Shelton before we realized we were lost. We'd been trying to follow the river, but at one point, Andy swore he heard muttering coming from over the hill. And so, the two of us clambered up it to investigate. All we found were old pine trees and empty dark. We turned around to circle back, but the river was gone. Vanished. We did our best to retrace our steps. We even followed our noses, hoping we could smell the stink of the town sewage that ran into the river. But it was no use. The river was lost, and so were we. We walked for 10, maybe 15 minutes before the sounds of the forest died. The shifting of branches, the pitter-patter of rodents darting across the dirt, the buzz of mosquitoes, and even the trill of crickets all turned to silence. It was like somebody had hit the switch on a stereo. Instant quiet. Andy and I stopped to listen, to observe, and we saw something shift in the trees. A large figure, maybe twice the size of a man, with round white eyes and a long twisting neck, was perched above us on a thick branch. It clicked at us. At first we thought it was speaking, trying to communicate, but then we realized the clicking wasn't coming from its face. It was coming from its hands. Its fingers, long and crooked, seemed to splinter into separate appendages. On either one of its hands were fans of hundreds of fingers, each gripping the tree branch while their nails picked away at the bark beneath. That picking was making the clicking sound. Its fingers were. Andy tried to speak to it. He tried to ask what it was doing here, to ask whether or not it was the thing that had killed poor little Greggy Hall, as though there was any doubt in our minds. But at that moment, the monster's fingers gripped the branch with such force that the entire thing snapped in two. The creature began plummeting to the earth like a giant, and I thought maybe our work would be done, and gravity would put an end to it. But it let loose a shrill shriek, and flapped its many-fingered hands like wings, and pressed itself into the air. It shrieked again, and its eyes, once white and round, became an acid painting of colours, horrible and bright, and anguishing. There weren't any reds or purples or greens. There were only the colours of blood, of bruises, of bile. It screeched again, and then swooped toward us. My heart thundered as I threw myself to the ground. But the thing, whatever it was, caught Andy in its grip. It caught him by his head, in 2 feet that resembled human jaws more than anything else. They were covered in white teeth, and it was at that moment that I knew I would never see my friend again. And I think he knew too. Andy shook and hollered. He screamed and shouted, but all of it was only for the span of 6 seconds, because not a moment later, the thing clenched its jaws, its feet. Andy's head split open like a jack-o'-lantern, his inside splattering me like a water balloon. I had to go. I turned, running full tilt from this thing. I didn't know where I was running. I didn't even know if I could reasonably run anywhere, that this monster couldn't reach me. But I knew that I had to try. I had to, because if I didn't, then I would end up just like Andy. Just like Greggy. As my feet pounded the earth, my heart pounded my chest. I ripped off my Dracula cloak, terrified of it tripping me up on an errant rock, and doubled over as my lungs burned. I'd never run so hard in my life, never so fast. And it wasn't enough, not even close. With a beat of its fingered wings, the beast crashed down in front of me. It towered above me, standing over 9 feet tall, with its terrible technicolor eyes, swirling like promises of violence. "Looking for me," it uttered, in such a low, broken voice that I almost missed it. "You killed Greggy?" I said. It seemed a stupid, obvious thing to say after watching my best friend's head crack open like an egg, but it was all I could manage. At that moment, I was so shocked, so traumatized, that I reverted to our hypothesis, our mission. "Yes," the thing said. It rose up, and now I could see it clearer. Beneath the faint scraps of moonlight that pierced the veil of leaves, I bore witness to a monster with saucer-shaped eyes, a set of long arms ending in legions of decrepit fingers, and 2 legs that each hosted a mouth where there should have been feet. It stepped toward me, walking on its teeth. "Who are you?" I asked, swallowing. "Are you him? The decrepit one?" It took a breath, a long, harsh breath that sounded like it might have gurgled razor blades in its lungs. When it spoke, it breathed cold air into me. "I am you." It took another 2-field step, and I staggered backwards. My world spun, but I wasn't sure if that was because of my fear, my grief at losing Andy, or the awful kaleidoscope of horror playing out in its swirling eyes. "What does that mean?" It didn't respond. It reached a hand out toward me, and its eyes swirled faster and faster, like a blender of madness, its teeth snapping as it took its next steps. "Pelere!" shouted a voice. The monster recoiled. Its long neck twisted like a snake as its eyes blinked and faded like a television reception dying in the storm. It curled into a ball, wrapping itself with its hundreds of fingers, before disappearing into a gust of dead leaves. I took a breath. Above, the moon seemed to glow a little brighter, and beside me, the sound of the river returned. Crickets filled the night. The wind whistled in my ears. It was as though the world had come back into focus, and I had been pulled out of a dream. All because of... "Hello?" I said, wheeling about. There'd been a voice, a loud one, that was commanding and full of authority, and speaking a language I didn't understand. But where was... Oh. There he was, down by the river. "You all right, son?" the pastor asked. I shook my head. "No, my friend's dead, and—" "Yes, I see what's left of him on your shirt." The pastor paused, looking me over. "What made you go looking for that creature?" "It killed Greggy Hall," I sputtered. "We wanted proof." "No such thing. Not when it comes to the decrepit one. It's closer to a fort than a being of flesh and blood. You can't take pictures of it. Can't record audio. Believe me, I've tried. It feeds off of fear. It feeds off of people like your friend, like you, who go looking for nightmares in all the right places. If it gets strong enough, we lose." He must have registered the confusion on my face. "By which I mean that we die. This town, you and me, your mother and father and sisters and brothers. All of us fall into deadly reverie, and poof, off goes our heads." "How do we stop it?" "We don't. Or at least, you don't. I do. I brought it here after all, so it only makes sense that I should be the one to get rid of it." "You brought it here?" "Yes. When I performed the exorcism of Sally Hall, it had been living in her, see, hiding. Her mother noticed it, bless her heart, and she requested I remove the being from her daughter. But it was too powerful for me to destroy it. And so, instead, I had to compromise. Think quickly." I swallowed, the pieces beginning to line up in my head. "You had to chain it here, didn't you? To this forest?" The pastor nodded. "It was all I could do." He sighed, put an arm around my shoulder, and told me that he'd walk me home. He explained that after what happened to Greggy, he had been petitioning to the mayor to block access to the Shelton Wood, out of respect, to have it marked as a burial ground, a memorial. He told me there had been some pushback at the time. Folks didn't want to sacrifice a slice of forest for a single dead kid. But now that the same fate had befallen Andy, he counted on the mayor changing his tune. And by the next week, the mayor had. The section of Shelton was closed off to everybody but investigators. Soon enough, even they quit going through. It became a dead zone, a piece of the map that didn't even exist anymore, far as anybody was concerned. The simple fact was that there are too many bad memories, too many reminders of the horror that had taken place there. It's been years now, and I no longer celebrate Halloween. I can't. It reminds me of Andy, of little Greggy, and of the decrepit one with all its fingers. For a while there, I thought I'd actually moved past all of this, left it behind me. But then, tonight, I saw something from my window that sent my blood cold. Amidst the shifting clouds of the black Halloween sky, framed in the light of the moon, was a large bird. A bird with 1,000 fingers on either hand, and feet lined with teeth. A bird flying away from Shelton Wood. A bird flying to town.
It's been a long time since I've had a session with Dave. Not his real name, of course. He had stopped attending therapy sessions in over a year, and I was surprised when he called to book a session. He had first come to me a few months after he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia, at age 29. His then partner had shared, through a veil of tears, about how his quality of life had deteriorated over the past 2 years. She first became alarmed when he had started to overlook his hygiene, his dressing, not seeming to care about how he appeared to others. He had insisted that he was fine, but then had withdrawn from his friends and family. He spoke only to her, and eventually started to ignore and neglect her as well. He lost his job and spent most days holed up in his room, mumbling under his breath or talking aloud to no one. He wouldn't tell her who he was talking to. He refused to seek help, despite her desperate pleas. It was only after an incident where he was arrested by the police that he finally began to receive treatment. He had climbed into someone's house and nearly been attacked by the owners when they found him in their living room, sat within a circle of lit candles, mumbling unintelligible phrases over and over again. By the time we were having sessions together, he had been stabilized with medication, but the voice he heard persisted. It was not part of his hallucinations. He insisted. It was real as you, me, and anyone else, he said. I had tried explaining to him about his illness, about how the voice, while seeming real to him, was not really there, outside his mind. I tried to discuss with him how schizophrenia causes these really vivid hallucinations, but nothing could convince him that the voice was but a symptom. In the first 2 months, after his therapy sessions began, his partner left him. She couldn't handle his deterioration, and she feared that he'd turn violent. That was an unfortunate stigma people tended to have about schizophrenia patients. In reality, they were more likely to be victims of violence than the aggressors. I continued to see Dave for a period of about 6 months, but one day, he just stopped attending therapy. He had found another therapist, he said. I didn't really mind. After all, not all therapists are well matched with their clients, and I was happy he had found someone who suited him, who could help him. Now, 1.5 years later, he had called, out of the blue, to request a session. He had been cryptic on the phone, not sharing why he needed a session now. When he walked into the room, I was taken aback by the change in his demeanor, his whole presentation. He looked healthy, well-groomed, and all cleaned up. He had a glow to his face, a light in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "You look great," I couldn't help but exclaim. "Hi, Doc," he said chirpily, and plopped himself on the seat near me. "Hi, Dave. Again, you look great. I'm guessing things have been good." "Yeah, I worked it out with my therapist. You were right. I shouldn't resist it. I should work with it." "With it?" "The treatment, the suggestion, those given by my therapist." He smiled and leaned forward slightly. "You were right. I had so much trouble. I was in such a deep, dark place, floundering, and so much of it was because I had been fighting against it. I dedicated so much time, so much effort, struggling against it. But you were right after all. The voice, he wasn't someone I should have fought. I let go, one day, of my need to control it, to stop it, to get rid of it. I let go, and the voice, it became clearer, warmer, and then he took shape. He'd taken form before, but it had been a hazy blur, something I tried to ignore, willing it to disperse from my sight. But after I embraced his presence, he took a solid form, and he finally appeared to me, clear as day. He looks like a regular guy. He has kind eyes. I sat through his monologue, silent, not wanting to interrupt. I have to admit, I was intrigued. Dave smiled and continued. "He was there, when you were talking to me. He hadn't shown himself properly then, but he was always there, hovering, He took in a lot of what you said, what I shared, and it turns out he's a really smart guy. He learned really quickly. I think he did his own research too, because he started having his sessions with me, and he was just like you at first, in how he guided me through my feelings, my thoughts. The therapist he had found had been his hallucination. It was unheard of, at least not in my years of experience. For a client to hallucinate a therapist, who then effectively guided the client to better mental health. It was incredible. I strained to keep my expressions in check. It worked, more or less. I was able to sort out so many things in the year of therapy I had with him. And he provided therapy free. No offense to you. He evolved too. He started using techniques that you hadn't done with me. So I think he really did do a lot of research, a lot of trial and error. So, when you said you found another therapist, you meant him, the voice you've been hearing, and the guy you've started to see. I didn't want to minimize his views, his beliefs. I was careful not to call his hallucination what it was. A hallucination. Not at this point. That would only push him away. He nodded. So you've been seeing this man. Does he have a name? He's Jones. Yes, so you've been seeing Jones, who has been giving you therapy, and you've felt much better ever since. Is that right? Yes. Oh, he's been incredible. I've done so much work on myself, and he's always there for me, not just in sessions. He's there by my side most of the time. He makes sure I take care of myself. He catches my unhelpful actions, the negative thoughts I have. Well, he can't really read my mind. Not most of the time anyway, but he catches the looks on my face when I'm down, angry, anxious, confused, whatever. He catches those moods, asks me about my thoughts, and just does therapy on the spot. It's incredible how effective therapy is when it's 24/7. I didn't know what to say. I was flummoxed, entranced, and entirely grateful to get to be a part of this situation. It was a psychologist's wet dream to get an interesting case like this. I love complex cases, bizarre symptoms, and this was ticking all of the boxes. This isn't to say that I don't care about my clients as people. I do have a lot of empathy and compassion for them, but I'm just often intrigued by the inner workings of other people, and this was beyond fascinating. So, is he here right now, Jones? Yes, he is. He's checking you out, by the way. Oh, he says to clarify that he's not checking you out in a weird way. He's just trying to get a sense of you, and whatever this thing is that's hanging around you. My smile stiffened a little, and I suddenly felt a twinge of nervousness. The thing that's hanging around me? Yes. That brings me to why I'm here today. Jones, he likes your work, what you do with the clients. I think he's been hanging out around you sometimes, checking out your sessions with other clients, learning from you. It's part of his research and development, I guess. I squashed the slight discomfort that had begun to grow. He wanted me to come here today, to tell you about some guy, some thing he's seen, hanging about you. He's tried to talk to you, but you don't hear or see him. I didn't know what to say, so I simply paraphrased his words. Jones has been around me, and he's seen someone hanging out near me. Is that right? Yeah. He told me that there's this figure he's seen around you, on a couple of visits that he made. He's worried. I knew it was all in Dave's head, but I couldn't help but feel as if he'd trickled ice-cold water down my spine. I shuddered, involuntarily, and tried to hide it, speaking quickly. He's seen someone here with me, on some of the times he's been here, and he's concerned. Yes. Wait, he's telling me to tell you. Okay. Apparently he can sense their auras. Others like him. He says that there's a figure near you that emanates something sinister. It feels dark. Something's really wrong with it. I couldn't suppress the sensations that came over me at that point. I could feel the blood draining from my cheeks, my palms starting to sweat. An icy sensation wrapped itself around my neck, making it difficult to breathe. I tried to speak as calmly as I could. This is scaring me, Dave. I have not seen you in a year and a half, and you've come today to tell me about your friend, your therapist, Jones, whom only you can see and hear. You've also come to tell me about a figure, an evil being lurking near me, that Jones says he saw. I'm so sorry. This must be really unsettling for you. Really scary. I know how it sounds, but Jones likes you. He wants to keep you safe, to warn you. Oh God. Okay. He says it's here now. I pushed back my emotions, mentally forcing them into a little box in my mind. I took a deep breath. Do you see it too? I asked. No. I can only see Jones. We are connected. This thing, only Jones can see it. And what does Jones say he sees, exactly? It's... Dave looked like he was listening intently. Then his face changed, taking on a look of a deepening anxiety. He says it's on your shoulder now. Leaning on it, kind of. Or perched on it. He can't really tell. Every hair I had stood on end. The icy pressure around my neck seemed to tighten. I had a sudden, almost irresistible urge to run. To pluck myself from the seat and dash as quickly out of the room as possible. I forced myself to calm down. Dave, you're scaring me. And I know Jones. He's real to you, but he's not real to me. And what you are saying to me, though I know you mean well, it makes me really uncomfortable. Yes, that was it. It was all his hallucination. I knew it. Research knew it. Science was on my side. Dave was having an incredibly elaborate hallucination, delusion. And intricate as the story was, that was all it was. A story. Something he built up in his mind. His amazing, complicated mind. But still, it was nothing more than his imagination. I grasped onto that train of thought, like a shield, and felt somewhat comforted. The surety of science made me feel safe again. A touch of sadness spilt into the anxiety that was painted on Dave's face. Then he seemed to be listening, looking somewhere to my right. Jones said that last Friday you were wearing a blue sweater, and you were rushing into the clinic, and you made it just in time for your first appointment. A crack appeared on my mental shield. I had indeed been wearing a blue sweater last Friday, a sky blue one. I was almost late, and had been in a huge hurry that morning. Were you following me? Were you waiting outside? I asked, clinging determinedly onto the shield. Dave paused for a while, looking again at the empty space near me. You did some chair work for your first client. He told you about his experience with his mum when he was 6 years old. The mental shield disintegrated. The cold fear seeped through. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Jones says he's sorry. He knows there's client confidentiality involved, and he shouldn't have been sitting in on all those sessions. But he's hoping to make up for it by helping you with that thing with you now. I couldn't contain the dread any longer. I gave up on my professionally calm demeanor. What is he afraid it would do to me?
He says that it's draining your energy, depleting your life force. He's not sure how it works, but just by being in your proximity, it's feeding on you. Jones says that some of these creatures may even have the ability to plant thoughts in your head, influence the things you do. He's heard of one which made its victim kill someone before killing himself.
I stared blankly at Dave.
Jones says that he could try to reach out to it, get it to leave, but he's not sure if that would work. Alternatively,
Dave trailed off, and anxiety danced on his features. Alternatively?
He said he could stay with you for a while. He wants to know if you'd let him in, let him show himself to you. He could then guide you on what to do. Apparently it feeds on you most easily when you're unfocused, distracted, when your mind is in shambles. Jones wants to be there to monitor when that happens, and keep you focused, strong, and clear in thought. He thinks that eventually, if you're consistently being purposeful, clear-headed, it will leave and find an easier target.
I couldn't help but chuckle nervously. He can be transferred to me, and a clear head stops that thing.
Yes, Dave said. I don't want to lose him, but I think I can do without him for a few days, maybe even a few weeks. Would you be willing to take him on?
The conversation was getting out of hand. Not knowing what else to say, I just nodded. Dave nodded in return and closed his eyes. When he reopened them, he asked,
"Do you see him now?"
With trepidation, I turned to look around the room. A flood of relief surged through my body as I realized I saw no one. There was no one. I had been pulled into Dave's delusions and hallucinations, somehow buying into his stories, falling for the intricate tale his mind had concocted. This was ridiculous. I was a professional, a psychologist. The tension seeped away from my heart as I turned back to Dave. I resumed my previous professional manner. Dave, there is no one. I don't see anyone here. I don't hear anyone either.
Dave's face fell. You can't sense him. He's right there. He's looking at you.
I can't, Dave. He's what you see. I don't see him. Others don't see him.
He's there. Really. Maybe it takes a while. Maybe it works differently for you. Me and him, we're naturally in tune. Maybe you're not on the same wavelength.
I nodded, not wanting to push him too far. Dave, our hour is almost up. Thank you for having been so honest and open with me. I'd like to invite you back for another session soon. Would that be okay with you?
Dave seemed resigned, but he eagerly agreed to set another appointment in a few days' time. He seemed sure that I'd be able to see his truth soon. Mixed in with my relief, I also felt a deep, heavy sadness as I bade him goodbye. He was deeply ill. He was entranced in his delusions, and his hallucinations were becoming stronger. Much stronger than when we'd first met. He was so steeped in his beliefs that it had swayed even me. I wasn't sure what I could do for him, other than continue to suggest that he revisits his psychiatrist to titrate his medication. I felt incredibly drained after the eventful session with Dave. I powered through the remaining sessions I had with the other clients, and gratefully piled myself into my car at the end of the long work day. I nearly fell asleep at the wheel, but managed to get home safely with the help of heavy metal music. Finally, I could relax and eat my dinner in front of the TV, just some brainless binge watching ahead. I was microwaving my frozen dinner, hungrily counting down the seconds on the display, when I caught a glimpse of movement to my right. I turned.
and let out a scream. My heart leapt into overdrive. There stood a man wearing a mustard-coloured blazer, a grey tee, and jeans. He had tousled hair, brown eyes, and a weathered complexion. He stared at me in concern. "I'm really sorry to have startled you. I wasn't sure how else I could have approached you." "Who are you? Get out of my house!" I yelled, scrambling to grab my mobile phone. "I'm Jones," he said, in a voice as clear as the crinkle on his forehead. I sputtered. I don't know what kind of sick joke you're playing, but I heard fumbling at my door before it burst open. My neighbour and close friend stumbled in. We had exchanged keys to our houses before, just in case of emergencies. "Are you okay?" Her face was etched with alarm. "This man," I pointed at Jones, "he's trespassing in my house." "This man?" She stared at me, uncomprehending. "What man?" I stared at her, and at Jones. She followed my gaze, then looked around. "Are you okay? Hey, there's no one here, it's just us." I sat down on the floor with a heavy thump. She came up to me and hugged me. "Are you good? Hey, let me call someone. It's going to be okay." Jones just stood there quietly. I stopped her from making the call. I made up some excuse about being drained, tired, and on medication, about how that must have just made me see things. I just needed to sleep, I told her, and ushered her out of the house. I couldn't afford to be seen by others as having lost my mind. My career was at stake. She was puzzled and concerned, but didn't push. She agreed to leave, but was firm that she would check in on me again in the morning. The minute I shut the door behind her, he spoke. "It's still here with you. It's grasping onto your back. I think we need to get started on getting rid of it." My family was never particularly religious. Sure, we had a few rituals here and there, but nothing too overbearing. Except when it came to her. Perhaps a small-town mystery, or a scary story to keep kids in line come bedtime. The girl with the skipping rope had been a part of our hometown law for over 50 years. The rules were simple. After the sun went down, we were not to open the door if we heard a girl skipping rope outside. She would pretend to be lost and ask for her parents, but under no circumstances were we to help her. If we ignored her cries for help long enough, she would leave us alone. If you grow up with something, you come to accept it as gospel truth, no matter how implausible it may be. To me, she was nothing more than Santa's evil cousin who would visit us every couple of years. I was around 12 when I had my first encounter with her. Almost at the cusp of my teenage years, I had decided to subvert my parents' authority and watch late-night TV. I had heard from extremely reliable sources at school that they would play reruns of all my favourite shows at 12 a.m. Besides, it was a Friday night, and I didn't have to get up early. My parents had tucked me in and were out in the kitchen wrapping up dinner. I waited patiently, staring at the light at the threshold of my door. The dishwasher started running, and soon enough, the lights were turned off. Tiptoeing my way across the living room, I made myself comfortable in front of the TV. I had to increase the volume just enough to not arouse suspicion. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. Clank. I froze. I thought I had been busted. Dad must have opened his door and found me. Clank. I turned around, but he wasn't there. Clank. Soon enough, I heard hushed knocks on the door. I knew enough not to open it. Mum had drilled that into me.
Yet something about the sound drew me to it. I just had to see her. I struggled, but eventually decided to look out of the window to see who this girl was. I was pulling the curtains when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I was about to scream, but a hand was on my mouth. "What the hell are you doing? Shut up and don't move." It was my dad. He had heard the TV and spotted me next to the door. He slowly pulled me back and carried me to my room, but not before I was able to see her. I couldn't make out much. Her black hair was covering her face, and her eyes were pointed at the ground. She was dressed in white, but was covered completely in mud and dirt. She just stood there with her robe, waiting at the door. "What is wrong with you, Aaron? Have you lost your damn mind? Stay here. Let me get your mother." I knew I had messed up. Mum was going to kill me. She came in and started frantically pacing around the room. "She didn't open the door. I caught her in time," my dad said. "No, you don't understand. Being near her is enough of a curse. We are fucked." That was one of the few times I heard my mum curse. After what felt like an hour of yelling, I was told to go into my room. I was grounded for a week. In that week, Father Brown stopped by to bless the house. Mum and Dad became extremely reserved around me. You'd think I'd shot the family dog. Over the course of the next month, there were rumors that she was visiting the town again. Behaviors radically changed. What was once a bustling community was now at a standstill. Lights would be out by 9 p.m. Kids were not allowed to stay out after dark. Church was packed every Saturday. All of this seemed performative to me, until Mark disappeared. Mark had been one of my closest friends at school, and I had told him about my encounter multiple times. I knew he wasn't stupid enough to open the door. The police treated it as a missing case, but we all knew what had happened. I was an inconsolable mess for the rest of the year. Needless to say, I didn't ever stay up late again. Mark wasn't the only one, however. Next it was Mr. Paul, who lived by the river. Then Miss Wu, who ran our town bakery. And finally, a little girl named Julia disappeared from her mum's house. The police didn't know what to make of this. There were no clues to any of the disappearances. The doors were opened voluntarily. There were no signs of forced entry. The victims had seemed normal until their disappearance. No leads were ever found. Everyone stayed extremely vigilant. Parents would sleep with their kids with a shotgun next to the bed. Over the next year or two, the fear died down. No one really spoke about the disappearances, or the girl, although it was always a lingering thought for most people in town. A good amount of people moved, and the state dedicated more resources and personnel to our city. With the band-aid of time, things got better. 4 years later, they found Miss Wu's body in the forest. From what they could make of the corpse, she had been choked to death with a metal object. Her face was brutally caved in, and her skull had significant blunt force trauma. By this point, however, she was nothing more than a footprint in the newspaper. Eventually, I moved to the city. The girl with the skipping rope would pop up in my nightmares here and there, but besides that, I never paid much attention to her. Life was busy, and I wanted to move on from my small town. I turned 40 last year. Now, with a daughter of my own, I realized that my parents did their best to protect me my whole life. Perhaps it was this thought that led to the events of last night. "Mum, someone is at the door." My daughter startled me awake. It was 8 p.m, and it looked like I had fallen asleep on the couch. I got up to investigate. Clank, clank, clank. My blood ran cold, and it felt like my legs were giving out. I picked up my daughter and locked her in her room. 29 years. 29 years had gone by. I didn't believe this was happening. I was probably in one of my nightmares. Clank, clank, clank. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I was the scared child caught watching TV in the living room. The same force that compelled me to let her in all those years ago came back much stronger. I was able to gather myself and turned around to go to the room. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of her from the window. The same dirty white clothes, the same black hair. Except, this time, she was staring right at me, her eyes piercing through my soul. She smiled at me and beckoned me to let her in. I decided to run. But before I knew it, I was in the forest being pulled by my neck, 1,000 little knives being dragged across my back. The legends got one thing wrong. The sound was not her skipping rope. She had always been holding a long, metal chain. And now she was going to kill me with it. I struggled and tried to break free from the noose around my neck. I heard her laughing at my efforts. Please, please let me go. I have a daughter. I struggled to get the words out. Fueled by adrenaline, I pulled the chain forward to where I could catch my breath. I snuck out from under the chain and ran. I ran as fast as I could across the forest, but I could hear her following me. Someone spotted me by the highway and called the police. At the hospital, I tried explaining the girl with the chain who had tried to kill me. Yet, no one would believe me. Temporary psychosis, I believe they called it. The doctors theorized I had tried to harm myself, and I was committed for 7 days. My daughter has since been staying with my mum, and I can breathe a sigh of relief, because I know the girl will be waiting for me when I finally get out. There's an old well located in the middle of the woods that borders Penville. It's made of crumbling grey stone and partially hidden by moss, a wide ring in the ground that threatens to swallow the unwary. According to local legend, the well is haunted. Penville was founded in the late 1800s by the Fenbys, an English family that came to America to build a prosperous community. The family daughter pretended to be pious, but secretly worshipped the devil. One night, she made a pact with a demon. In exchange for eternal beauty and youth, she agreed to murder 9 children. 6 kids in this town were butchered like hogs, and their remains scattered throughout the woods. Before she could complete the 9th murder, the townspeople discovered that she was the one responsible for their children's deaths. They dragged her out of her home, tore out her eyes, and threw her into the well to die. She treaded water for nearly half an hour, and before dying of blood loss, she promised them that she would finish her bargain eventually. We found the well entirely by accident. It was a cloudless summer day, one we should have spent lounging by the public swimming pool and eating popsicles. Instead, Quentin and I followed James deeper into the woods. A stifling heat pressed down on me, and the toolbox James had ordered me to carry seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. I could hear Quentin panting harshly behind us as he struggled to keep up with James's pace. He carried the stack of wooden planks that would form the base of our treehouse. Even though I suspected we were lost, I knew better than to say anything. Before James transferred to our school, Quentin and I had been bullied relentlessly by a group of upperclassmen, with Quentin getting the brunt of it. And although I'd stood up for Quentin whenever possible, I hadn't been able to stop them from mocking his weight or his tendency to babble in stressful situations. James had. He was nearly as short as me, but the handful of times that the same group of upperclassmen had tried to bully James, their insults bounced off of him as though he wore an invisible suit of armor. Quentin had promptly latched onto James. Since Quentin was my best friend, I'd had no choice but to follow him, even though his hero worship of James bothered me. Frankly, I wasn't even sure whether I liked James. The price of his friendship was that he always bossed us around. More to the point, it increasingly felt like James went out of his way to make me the third wheel, and I couldn't help worrying that Quentin would replace me with him. It was why I'd been so determined to join them today. I didn't want to give James another excuse to cut me out. Wooden planks clattered to the floor. I turned around to see that Quentin had stopped in his tracks, the corners of his mouth drawn down in dismay. Sweat plastered his curly dark brown hair around his face. James didn't even notice. "It's this way," he said confidently. "We're almost there." "What's wrong?" A tentative hope crept over me. I didn't want to be the first one to ask for a break, but if Quentin needed one, then I had the perfect excuse to set down the hateful toolbox. He pointed wordlessly at something off to the side. I followed his gaze to see a pile of grey stones, half hidden by the surrounding foliage. I blinked and realized that it was a stone well, rising roughly 5 feet off of the ground. My stomach swooped unpleasantly, as though I'd missed a step while walking down the stairs. James finally realized that we'd stopped walking behind him. Frowning, he asked, "What's the big deal, guys?" "It's the well." Quentin gave the words an upward inflection as though asking a question rather than stating a fact. "You know, the one from the story about the woman who killed all those kids. We must be standing in the old town square. I can't believe no one else has found it before us." He trailed off. James brightened. "Let's go check it out." Quentin and I exchanged a resigned glance behind his back. James enjoyed breaking the rules. At school, he was always getting detention for skipping classes or smoking on campus. In retrospect, we should have known that the prospect of investigating an abandoned and supposedly haunted well would be irresistible to him. "Help me pull this off," he ordered, running his hands over the well and tugging on its wooden cover. Quentin obediently trudged over. I thought about protesting, but the sheer force of James's personality made it hard to stand up to him. He overwhelmed you with rapid-fire sentences and rhetorical questions, leaving you bobbing helplessly in his wake. And, if you annoyed him enough, he became witheringly sarcastic, even cruel. The more I told him not to do it, the more he'd want to. Anyway, a story about the well is just that, a story, I thought, trying to push away the sense of foreboding. Whoever made it up in the first place had nothing better to do with their time. The wooden cover came away easily in our hands, and an unpleasant smell drifted out of the well. Curious, despite myself, I leaned forward to peer down into it, my stomach churning with a combination of excitement and anxiety. I half expected to see a heap of mouldering bones at the bottom, but only murky water met my gaze. Sunlight clearly illuminated the well, and I guessed the depth to be 20 feet or so. Nothing moved in the water. "It doesn't," began James, but I never got to hear the rest of what he said. The part of the well that I'd been leaning against crumbled away under my weight, sending me tumbling down the well. The well was much deeper than I'd estimated, deep enough that I couldn't touch its bottom, and the water was freezing. I clung to the stones protruding from the well's walls as I treaded water, my teeth chattering from the cold and my head aching fit to burst. "Alex, can you hear me? Are you okay?" Quentin's voice ricocheted around the well, intensifying the bells clamoring in my head, and I winced. Without waiting for my response, he yelled, "Don't move! I'll be there soon." Minutes passed, and my fingers went stiff and numb, and I wondered if I'd ever be able to stop shivering. I threw a glance upwards. The sky had turned strangely grey and cloudy, and Quentin was nowhere in sight. Worry gnawed at me. Where was he? James wouldn't convince him to leave me here. Right? Suddenly, something next to me emerged from the water with a splash, startling me badly enough that I nearly lost my grip. After a moment of confusion, I realized that it was Quentin. He spluttered and coughed while treading water, and I breathed a sigh of relief. "Where did you come from?" "What do you mean? I was right there." He eyed me anxiously and repeated, "Are you okay?" I nodded and then stopped, and the motion hurt my head too much. I knocked my head pretty hard when I fell, but other than that, I think I'm all right. Do you think you can climb out of here? Maybe we should call someone. What if your head injury is serious and you need a doctor? "I can climb." I hesitated and added, "Thanks for coming after me, Q." He grinned at me. "Remember that time Richie threw my backpack into the dumpster and you jumped in to help me find it? Consider us even." It took a couple of tries and some help from Quentin, but I managed to find a crevasse that allowed me to pull myself up and out of the water. From there, it was easy to use the cracks between the stones as handholds and footholds, though my progress remained slow and painful. After I swung my legs over the lip of the well, I sat down with a hard thump, my head still throbbing with pain. Black sludge covered most of my t-shirt and shorts. I wanted nothing more than to be home right now, huddled under my duvet with a mug of hot cocoa on the nightstand. Absorbed in how miserable I felt, it took me a few minutes to realize that our surroundings had changed. A thick mist had appeared and turned the woods into a featureless landscape. Everything except for the well was colorless and washed out, and seemed as insubstantial as cobwebs. I heard that symptoms of a concussion could include blurry or double vision, but nothing like this. What if my fall down the well had irreparably damaged my eyesight? I looked around wildly and saw James standing a couple of feet away with his back to me. The mist half obscured him from view, but I could tell that he was soaked with water. It dripped down from his blonde hair and his sodden clothes, forming a puddle at his feet. And his skin was wrinkled, as if he'd spent too long in the shower. Weird, I thought. James hadn't come down into the well with us. "James, you can see that mist too, right?" He made no reply. Unease prickled down my spine. It wasn't like him to stay silent. If anything, he should have already been making fun of me for falling down the well so spectacularly. Right as I reached out to touch James's shoulder, he whirled around, and the question I had meant to ask died in my throat. He was smiling at me, an unnaturally wide smile that peeled his lips back from his teeth. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that James held a butcher knife in his right hand. I had no idea where he'd found it, but the blade seemed incredibly old. It was rusted and pitted from time. Rivulets of blood dropped down it and over its handle. His blood. He'd carved out ribbons of meat from his own body, plunging the knife into himself deeply enough that I could see glistening bone in some places. James started to advance on me, still smiling. Terror, warred with revulsion, sent my pulse racing. I knew that I had to run before he reached me, but my legs had turned leaden and uncooperative. All I managed was one stumbling step backwards. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the blood-stained knife. What the fuck happened to him? I flinched, half expecting to see James somehow transported behind me, but it was Quentin, his face white and set as he stared at James. He looked deeply unnerved. Where did he get that knife from? Jesus, we need to take him to a hospital right away. I don't know. I found him like this. James let out a sudden scream and doubled over, clawing at himself. The blood-soaked hands erupted from his stomach, sending viscera flying through the air. A shoulder emerged from his body, then a head and knee. A tall woman stepped out of James's body, as though it had simply been an ill-fitting suit she no longer needed. She left behind her a wreckage of flesh and bone that no longer even remotely resembled a human body. She had silver coins for eyes, and her dark hair floated around her as if she was underwater. When she contorted her face into a snarl, the coins squelched wetly in her eye sockets, and black water gushed out of her mouth, along with a torrent of squirming white bugs and dead leaves. She knelt down and picked up the butcher knife. "Run!" I yelled. "We have to run." We bolted. Quentin pulled ahead of me, and the mist swallowed him from view instantly. I soon became disoriented. I knew I was moving forward, but the mist made everything around me look exactly the same. There were no landmarks, no way for me to guide myself in the right direction. For all I knew, I was running in circles. Something knocked me off my feet. I fell hard, barely managing to avoid smashing my head into the ground, and twisted around to see her behind me. I tried to scramble back up to my feet and run, but she moved preternaturally quick. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't break her grip. She held me down with terrible strength, using only one hand. For a moment, she simply studied me, her silver coin eyes shining with incomprehensible emotion. Loathing? Triumph? A charnel house smell emanated from her skin, the smell of blood, rot, and feces. Her throat made a rattling sound. She might have been trying to speak, but if so, I couldn't understand her. The knife rose into the air. I searched desperately for something to defend myself with, but my grasping hands met nothing besides dirt. There was no weapon conveniently nearby, and no way for me to wrest the knife from her. So instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out and ripped off the silver coin that served as her right eye. It tumbled away, along with a handful of mushy, rotting flesh that felt like wet sand. She opened her mouth in a silent scream of rage and agony and brought the knife down. At first, I thought that she'd missed. All I felt was the pressure of her arm striking me. Nothing else. But then, heat began to spread through my stomach, and I looked down to see the knife protruding from it. That was when the pain hit, pain unlike anything I'd ever known. Dizziness overwhelmed me, and purple dots danced before my eyes. She yanked the knife back out, and blood, my blood, sprayed over her face. From a great distance, I heard Quentin shout, "Get off of her!" I must have blacked out, because the next thing I could remember was Quentin dragging me forward, one arm thrown around me. He staggered under my weight, nearly sending us both sprawling. I couldn't see the woman anywhere in the mist, but I knew she had to be nearby. As I glanced around us, I thought I saw screaming faces in the mist. Children's faces. They formed, vanished, then reformed again. Quentin asked, "What do we do? There's nowhere to go. I tried running away as far as I could, and just ended up back here again. All she has to do is wait for us to tire out." An idea occurred to me, catalyzed by the fact that everything else in this world was grey and dead. I think the well is the key to leaving. After we reached the bottom and came back up, that's when we found ourselves here, right? If we go down it again, maybe we'll get home. I forced myself to continue to say, "You should leave me behind." Quentin stared at me. "What are you talking about?" "I'm slowing you down. You can make it if you hurry. And if you leave me behind, she'll be, distracted." Quentin hesitated, the struggle written in his face. He knew I was right. If he had to keep carrying me, she'd probably catch up with us before we reached the well, and I'd already been stabbed. I might not be a doctor, but I was pretty sure that if I didn't get medical attention soon, I'd bleed out and die anyway. I thought I could hear eager, squelching footsteps drawing closer to us, and reminded myself that Quentin was simply making the most logical decision. Abruptly, he said, "You're the only one, besides James, who's ever treated me like I'm human." He shrugged, looking both defiant and embarrassed. "You're my best friend. I'm not leaving you behind." I swallowed past the lump in my throat, unable to think of a reply that wouldn't sound cheesy or ridiculous. We took another couple of staggering steps forward, in the direction Quentin said he remembered the well being. Gradually, I caught sight of a blurry and indistinct blob. As we neared it, it resolved into a familiar shape. Unlike everything else here, the well looked solid and real. I fixed my eyes on it, willing it to magically move closer, and fought to put one foot in front of the other. The pain in my stomach sharpened with each passing second. When we finally reached the well, I had to stop and lean against it to remain upright. I could barely breathe. "We're going to make it," I told myself. "You just have to hang in there and climb down." It occurred to me that it was quiet. Too quiet. My head jerked up, and I scanned our surroundings frantically, my heart pounding. The dark silhouette ran toward us. I shoved Quentin towards the well. "She's here. Go!" I tried to scramble into the well and failed. She emerged from the fog, and there was nothing human about her now. The silver coin that was her left eye burned with cold fire, dangled from her face by a string of decayed flesh. She'd grown a double row of needle-sharp teeth, too many to fit inside her mouth. When she snapped them at me, they sent chunks of her lips falling to the ground. I was suddenly sure that I could run forever. I used the fresh surge of adrenaline to heave myself up and into the well, and threw myself down. In a matter of seconds, ice-cold water closed over me, threatening to steal the breath from my lungs. I counted until 10, and then swam upwards. It took every ounce of strength I had to keep moving. As soon as my head broke the surface, I knew I'd been right. Warm sunlight filled the well, and there was a cloudless blue sky far above us, visible through the opening of the well. Quentin had already climbed more than halfway up. He paused, waiting for me. I grinned at him helplessly, so relieved that I couldn't speak. We made it back. I thought, we're back, and She's coming after us. Quentin's words momentarily froze me in place. Frustration and fear swept over me. I'd never considered the possibility that she might be able to follow us from the world under the well. I climbed up as quickly as I could, which wasn't that quickly. When I chanced to glance downwards, I saw her peering up at us, her face twisted in hatred. She started clambering up the walls of the well, impossibly fast, moving in a sideways scuttle reminiscent of a spider. Her limbs twisted and contorted unnaturally around her, while her head remained perfectly still. She was catching up to me. "Watch out!" I glanced down in time to see her reaching out for me with one bone-white hand. Layers of skin sloughed off of it and floated through the air. Her fingernails were black with rot, some of them already loose and peeling away. I managed to duck away from her grasp, but nearly lost my balance, my fingertips brushing the stone as I pinwheeled my arms. I couldn't keep dodging her, not without falling back down to the bottom of the well, and I couldn't climb up quickly enough to escape either. Time slowed down. Seconds stretched into minutes as she reached for me again. I had a jumbled mess of fleeting impressions, various moments from my life flashing before my eyes. I wanted to say something brave, something that would leave Quentin with one last good memory of me. But nothing came to mind, except for, "I don't want to die." I looked up, and he was still too far away to help me, nearly at the top of the well. He stared at me with an uncertain expression on his face and took a deep breath. He said, "I'm not leaving you behind." And then he threw himself at her and dragged her down the well.